Not the peaceful kind that settles over old houses at dusk, but a heavy, listening silence, as if the abandoned mansion itself were holding its breath. The plantation house stood half swallowed by moss and vines, its white columns cracked and leaning like broken teeth. For more than a century, no one had lived there. Locals called it La Maison Maudite, the cursed house, and most refused to step onto the land even in daylight. Yet here they were. The renovation crew had been hired by a private buyer from New Orleans, a man who believed old legends were nothing more than superstition. He wanted the mansion restored, turned into a historical attraction. Money talks louder than fear, and so 5 men crossed the rusted iron gate early one morning, their boots crunching on gravel that had not been disturbed in decades. Inside, dust floated in the air like pale ghosts. The walls were stained dark, not just with age, but with something that looked uncomfortably like dried blood. Long corridors stretched into shadows, and every footstep echoed far longer than it should have. "Place gives me a bad feeling," muttered Jean, the oldest of the crew. He wiped sweat from his brow, though the air was cold. They began in the east wing, where part of the floor had collapsed. As they cleared debris, one of the men, Caleb, struck something solid beneath the rotten boards. Not stone, not metal, wood. They pried up the planks and uncovered a small hidden compartment beneath the floor. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in blackened cloth, tied tightly with red thread. The moment the cloth was disturbed, the smell hit them: rotting herbs, old wax, and something sharp and metallic. "Don't touch that," Jean whispered. Too late. Caleb pulled the cloth away. Inside were 13 dolls. They were crudely made, each stitched from dark fabric, their faces twisted into expressions of pain. Rusted nails pierced their chests, arms, and eyes. Some had tiny nooses around their necks. Others were burned, the cloth charred black. Every doll had a name scratched into a small wooden tag tied to its wrist. 13 names. 13 human names. As Caleb lifted one doll, the candlelight flickered violently, though there was no wind. Somewhere deep in the mansion, a door slammed shut on its own. That night, none of the men slept. And far away, in the town nearest the plantation, an old woman who had lived there all her life woke from a nightmare screaming one word over and over again. "He has been disturbed." To understand what those dolls truly meant, one had to go back more than 100 years, to Louisiana in the 1850s, when the plantation was alive, the fields ran red with blood and sweat, and a slave who knew the secrets of the spirits decided that suffering would no longer go unanswered. And when he cursed the plantation, he made sure it would never forget his name. Before the mansion rotted and the fields turned wild, the plantation had a name spoken with pride by white men and with terror by everyone else: Belle Rive. At dawn, the bell rang. Its sound cut through the fog like a blade, dragging men and women from shallow sleep. Chains rattled, bare feet met cold earth. The Mississippi air was thick, heavy with heat even in the early morning, and it carried the smell of sugarcane, sweat, and decay. Among the slaves was a man called Ezekiel. That was not the name his mother gave him, but it was the one the master used, so it was the one written in the ledgers. Ezekiel worked in the shadows of the plantation, not in the fields, but near the big house. He cleaned rooms, carried water, buried what needed to be buried. Because of this, he saw things others did not. He saw overseers drag girls into locked rooms. He saw bodies carried out at night, wrapped in sheets, their throats bruised, their backs torn open by the whip. And he saw something else. Ezekiel's grandmother had come from St. Domingue before the Revolution, stolen and sold south. Before she died, she taught him the old ways in whispers, always at night, always in fear. She taught him the names of spirits that did not belong to white men. Spirits that listened when blood touched earth. Spirits that remembered injustice. Power, she told him once, her voice shaking, is never free. It always wants something back. The master of Belle Rive, Charles Devereux, was a cruel man even by the standards of his time. He believed fear was the purest form of control. When a slave tried to run, Devereux didn't just punish him, he made sure everyone watched. The first death happened in the summer. An overseer named Thomas Reed was found hanging from a tree near the cane fields. His neck snapped clean, as if twisted by invisible hands. No rope was ever found. Devereux called it an accident. A warning from God, perhaps. 2 weeks later, another overseer collapsed in the stables, coughing blood until his lungs drowned him from the inside. Doctors were called. They blamed fever. Ezekiel said nothing. That night, beneath the slave quarters, he carved a small doll from scraps of cloth and hair taken from the dead man's jacket. He pressed a rusted nail into its chest and whispered a name into the darkness. The candle did not flicker. The ground did. By the end of the year, 3 white men were dead. The slaves noticed patterns the masters refused to see. Each death followed a punishment. Each body fell after screams echoed from the big house. And always, Ezekiel was nearby, not watching, not celebrating, only listening. Devereaux began to drink heavily. The plantation dogs howled at nothing. Horses refused to enter certain fields. At night, servants swore they heard footsteps in empty hallways and the sound of soft chanting beneath the floorboards. One evening, Devereaux confronted Ezekiel. "You," he said, pointing with a trembling hand. "You bring sickness with you." Ezekiel lowered his eyes, as he was expected to do. But inside, something ancient smiled. Because the spirits had tasted blood now, and they were no longer satisfied with just overseers. It was Devereaux's youngest son, Henri, a boy of 12 who liked to throw stones at slaves as they worked and laughed when they bled. One afternoon, Henri went riding near the swamp at the edge of the plantation. He never returned. They found him at sunset. His horse stood calm and untouched, reins loose. Henry's body lay half submerged in shallow water, his eyes wide open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. There were no bite marks. No wounds. Yet his chest was crushed inward, ribs folded like paper, as if something enormous had pressed down on him from above. The doctor whispered a word no one liked. Pressure. Devereaux screamed that night, not the roar of an angry master, but the sound of a man whose world had cracked. He ordered the slaves lined up at dawn. Men, women, children, everyone. Someone was guilty. Someone would pay. The whip sang until arms went numb. A pregnant woman collapsed and did not get up. A boy lost an eye. Blood soaked into the dirt, dark and warm. Through it all, Ezekiel stood perfectly still, his face empty, his breathing slow. That night, beneath the floor of his small quarters, Ezekiel worked again. This time the doll was different. It was wrapped in cloth taken from Henry's riding coat. A lock of the boy's hair was tied around its neck. Ezekiel hesitated before pressing the nail in. Not because he felt pity, but because the spirits were closer now. He could feel them watching. "You said 13, he whispered into the darkness. "I will give you 13. The candle went out on its own. From that moment, the plantation began to rot while it still lived. Milk soured within hours. Meat crawled with maggots before it was cooked. Slaves fell ill and recovered quickly, but white men sickened and wasted away. Mirrors cracked. Floors groaned even when no one walked on them. Devereaux called for a priest. The priest lasted 3 nights. On the 4th morning, he was found in the chapel, his tongue torn from his mouth, his Bible soaked in blackened blood. Symbols were carved into the walls, marks older than Christianity, older than the plantation itself. Panic spread. Devereaux locked himself in the big house and began sleeping with a pistol under his pillow. He ordered Ezekiel brought before him again. "You've been near every curse," Devereaux hissed, his eyes sunken, his hands shaking. "What are you doing to my land?" Ezekiel looked up. For the first time in his life, he met his master's eyes. "I am only listening," he said softly. That night, the 4th doll was made, and the 5th followed before the moon changed. By the time Devereaux understood the truth, that the plantation itself had turned against him, it was already too late. The spirits Ezekiel had called did not distinguish between innocent and guilty, child or man. They only counted, and they were patient. Lanterns burned all night in the big house. Doors were nailed shut, then nailed again. Devereaux dismissed half his servants, convinced spies and traitors surrounded him. But fear has a smell, and it spread faster than reason. Even loyal men began to whisper. The deaths were no longer quiet. One overseer was found in the cane press, his bones ground into the machinery as if he had willingly fed himself to it. Another drowned in a dry well, his lungs filled with mud and frogs. A third locked himself in his room and still died, his spine bent backward at an impossible angle, as though something had climbed inside him and pulled. 7 men, 7 dolls, each one hidden beneath Ezekiel's floor, laid in a careful circle, their red threads crossing like veins. With every death, the spirits demanded more precision, more memory. Ezekiel began carving symbols into his own skin so he would not forget the words they taught him in dreams. They showed him things. He saw his grandmother young again, standing in fire without burning. He saw the plantation long after it would fall, empty halls, broken walls, strangers uncovering what had been buried. And always, the number 13 burned in his vision like a brand. Devereaux finally broke. He ordered Ezekiel chained in the cellar beneath the house, iron biting into flesh, darkness pressing in. "If you're the root," Devereaux said, his voice cracking, "you'll rot here." That night, Devereaux's wife died screaming. She clawed her own eyes out before throwing herself down the main staircase. When her body was carried away, black thread was found knotted tightly around her wrists, thread no one owned. In the cellar, Ezekiel smiled for the first time. Chains meant nothing now. The spirits did not need his hands anymore. They moved through walls, through bloodlines, through guilt. They punished cruelty wherever it had grown. The eighth doll formed itself. Ezekiel did not touch it. In the slave quarters, hope stirred, quiet, dangerous hope. People whispered that Bel Rive was cursed, that God or something older had chosen sides. Some prayed, others feared Ezekiel more than they feared Devereaux. Then the punishment came. Devereaux ordered 3 slaves burned alive in the fields as an offering to cleanse the land. Their screams rose into the night sky, sharp and endless. The spirits answered immediately. Lightning struck the big house though the sky was clear. Fire tore through silk curtains and polished wood. Devereaux barely escaped, his face blistered, his hair gone. He fell into the mud outside, weeping, calling for mercy from any power that would listen. None did. That night, the 9th and 10th dolls were completed. And Ezekiel knew the end was close. Because the spirits had begun to whisper a final price. Not for Devereaux, but for the one who had summoned them. Before, they had spoken like wind through cane fields, soft, coaxing, almost kind. Now they sounded like cracking wood and breaking bone. They no longer asked Ezekiel what he wanted. They told him what they would take. In the cellar, weak with hunger and thirst, Ezekiel dreamed with his eyes open. Rats gathered near his chains but did not bite him. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing like a heartbeat. In that darkness, the spirits came close enough for him to smell them, earth, iron, and old blood. "You promised 13, they said without mouths. "I will give them," Ezekiel whispered. "Only the guilty." There was a pause. Then laughter. Not cruel, not joyful, but absolute. "Guilt does not belong to one man," the spirits replied. "It spreads." Above him, Bel Rive collapsed inward. Slaves fled into the swamps under cover of night. Others stayed, trapped by fear or loyalty or nowhere else to go. Devereaux wandered the ruins like a ghost, muttering his son's name, clutching a pistol with no bullets left. The 11th death came quietly. Devereaux's eldest daughter, Marguerite, was found in her room, perfectly still in her bed. No wounds, no marks, just a look of unbearable terror frozen on her face, as if she had watched something crawl out of the walls and lean close enough to breathe into her mouth. When her body was moved, a small doll fell from beneath the mattress. No one had put it there. The 12th death followed at dawn. Devereaux himself. They found him kneeling in the ashes of the burned wing, hands clasped in prayer, eyes turned skyward. His chest was split open from the inside, ribs bent outward like a broken cage. His heart was gone, not eaten, taken. The plantation fell silent. Chains were unlocked. Gates stood open. Bel Rive, once a kingdom of terror, became a corpse. The remaining slaves fled or scattered, carrying stories they barely understood. Some said Ezekiel had become a demon. Others said he had become a saint. Only Ezekiel knew the truth. That night, the spirits came for the 13th. In the cellar, the chains fell away on their own. The final doll lay before him, formed from his own blood-soaked shirt, his own hair, his own name carved deep into the wood. "You are the door," the spirits said. "And doors do not remain." Ezekiel did not scream when the nail pressed into the doll's heart. Above him, the plantation groaned one last time, settling into the earth like a body laid to rest. By morning, the cellar was empty. No body was ever found. Only 13 dolls remained beneath the floor, waiting. And more than a century later, when strangers pried them loose from the dark, the spirits woke again. Because the curse had never ended. It had only been sleeping. Caleb, the man who had lifted the doll, was driving home alone when his truck stalled on a straight, empty road. The engine hadn't overheated. The tank wasn't empty. It simply died, as if something had reached inside and turned its heart off. Fog rolled in fast, swallowing the trees, the sky, the road. Caleb stepped out to check the hood. That was when he heard the counting. Not out loud, not in the air, but inside his skull, slow and deliberate, like fingers tapping bone. 1. He ran. They found him at dawn hanging from a roadside oak. No rope. His neck twisted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible. In his pocket was a small scrap of black cloth tied with red thread. The other workers quit immediately. All except Jean. Jean had grown up hearing stories about Belle Rive. About dolls. About a slave who knew how to speak to things that did not forgive. When he saw Caleb's body, Jean understood something the others didn't. The curse had rules. 13 dolls. 13 deaths. And once disturbed, the counting began again. Jean returned to the mansion alone. Beneath the East Wing floor, the dolls lay where the police had left them, sealed as artifacts. But something was wrong. The circle had shifted. Threads tightened and loosened as if breathing. One doll, the one Caleb had touched, now had fresh blood soaking its chest. Jean dropped to his knees. "Please," he whispered. "It's over. They're all dead." The answer came from the walls. Not all. Memories flooded him, memories that were not his. He saw Ezekiel in the cellar. Saw the final nail. Saw the promise twisted by spirits older than justice. The curse had not been bound to men. It had been bound to ownership. As long as Belle Rive belonged to someone, anyone, the debt could be collected again. Jean understood too late. The buyer from New Orleans arrived the next morning, furious about delays. He never made it past the gate. The iron spikes bent inward, piercing his lungs like spears. His death marked the second. The mansion woke fully then. Doors slammed. Floors bled sap that smelled like rot. At night, lights flickered in rooms with no power. Locals began seeing figures in the windows, one tall, thin shadow always standing behind the others. Jean tried to burn the dolls. They would not burn. He tried to bury them. They returned. On the 7th night after Caleb's death, Jean sat in the main hall with a shotgun across his knees and 13 dolls arranged before him. "I won't let you finish," he said to the dark. The candles went out. The counting resumed. 3. Neighbors later swore they heard a bang echo across the fields just before midnight, but when the police arrived, the shotgun lay untouched on the floor. Jean sat upright in a chair, eyes open, mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. His spine had collapsed inward, vertebrae crushed as if a massive weight had settled onto his shoulders and pressed down slowly, patiently. 3. News spread fast after that. Not through newspapers, those stories were buried or rewritten, but through whispers. People spoke of Belle Rive again, of the cursed land that refused owners, of a debt that could not be paid with money or fire. The state sealed the property. Chains went up. Warning signs followed. But chains had never stopped spirits, and signs meant nothing to the dead. At night, the mansion glowed. Not with light, but with memory. Inside, the dolls rearranged themselves. 4 now stood apart from the circle, their threads stretched tight, trembling like living veins. The air inside the house grew thick, heavy with the same smell Ezekiel had known in the cellar, iron and damp earth. The 4th death was a thief. A local man who believed the dolls were valuable artifacts slipped past the fence and into the mansion with a backpack and a crowbar. He was found 2 days later inside the walls themselves, his body folded into the narrow space between bricks, bones snapped and twisted so completely that it looked as if the house had swallowed him. 4. After that, people stopped pretending it was coincidence. A historian from Baton Rouge arrived with a team, claiming academic interest. She spoke confidently about folklore, mass hysteria, and shared trauma. She dismissed the curse as a narrative constructed by suffering people. That night, she dreamed of counting. She woke screaming as invisible fingers stitched her lips shut from the inside. By morning, she had bled to death in her hotel room, 13 shallow puncture wounds across her chest. 5. The spirits were accelerating. They no longer waited for direct contact. Proximity was enough. Intent was enough. To want Belle Rive was to invite judgment. The 6th death came with fire. A developer bribed officials and ordered heavy machinery onto the land. When the first excavator's shovel struck the soil, the ground collapsed beneath it. The machine tipped forward, burying the operator alive as the earth closed over him like water. 6. Locals began leaving offerings at the gate, candles, rum, coins, scraps of cloth tied with red thread. Some prayed to God, others prayed to Ezekiel, though none knew if he still existed as a man. Inside the mansion, the tall shadow in the windows grew clearer. It was no longer just watching. It was counting too, and somewhere beneath the floor, the dolls shifted again. Because the spirits had reached the number they loved most. Halfway. And once the count passed 7, they would not stop for mercy, reason, or regret. They would stop only when the debt, old as chains, old as ownership, was paid in full. A young couple camping illegally near the plantation fence fell asleep holding hands, laughing about ghost stories and curses they didn't believe in. Sometime before dawn, they stopped breathing at the exact same moment. No wounds, no poison, their hearts simply forgot how to beat. The coroner wrote natural causes twice. The dolls tightened their circle. After 7, the rules changed. The spirits no longer needed trespassers. Belle Rive's reach stretched outward, like roots searching for water. Anyone who tried to claim, study, profit from, or erase the plantation felt it, an invisible pressure behind the eyes, a sense of being watched from behind even in locked rooms. Phones failed near the property. Compasses spun uselessly. Animals refused to cross the old boundary lines, drawn long ago in blood and surveyor's ink. The 8th death was a judge. He had signed the final approval papers to auction the land, calling it unused state property. That night, every mirror in his house cracked at once. His wife found him kneeling in the bathroom, face pressed to shattered glass, his reflection missing its eyes. 8. Panic reached the churches. Priests arrived with holy water. Pastors came with hymns. They prayed, shouted, demanded answers. The mansion listened politely. One preacher dared to shout Ezekiel's name, claiming authority over whatever lingered there. The spirits answered by breaking his voice. He survived, but never spoke again. His tongue remained intact, yet no sound ever came from his mouth. He understood then. Silence was also a punishment. The 9th death followed within hours. A state archivist reviewing old plantation records collapsed at her desk. When coworkers found her, her fingers were bent backward, snapped clean as if each had been counted individually. 13 ledgers lay open around her, pages fluttering though the windows were closed. 9. That night, the shadow in the mansion stepped forward. For the first time, someone saw its face. A local woman driving past the property swore the figure stood on the balcony, tall and thin, eyes glowing faintly like candle embers. She recognized the face from nowhere and everywhere at once, scarred, calm, unbearably tired. Ezekiel, she whispered. The figure inclined its head. Not in greeting, in acknowledgement, because the spirits were no longer leading the count. They had given it back to the one who had started it. And Ezekiel, whatever he had become, walked the halls of Belle Rive again, touching walls, remembering screams, tracing old bloodstains with hands that were no longer fully human. The dolls responded. 10 threads pulled tight at once. Somewhere far from Louisiana, a man who had never heard of Belle Rive woke suddenly from a dream of chains and cane fields, his chest aching as if something had marked him. He had just purchased the land's mineral rights. And the spirits smiled, because only 3 remained. And the last deaths would not be quick. They would be remembered. The man who owned the mineral rights lived nearly 500 miles away. He had never set foot in Louisiana, never seen Belle Rive, never smelled the rot in its walls. To him, the land was a number on a contract, a promise of profit buried underground. Distance did not protect him. On a Tuesday morning, during a board meeting filled with coffee and quiet confidence, he stopped speaking mid-sentence. His eyes fixed on something no one else could see. He clawed at his chest, tearing through his shirt as if trying to pull something out. When he collapsed, the floor beneath his chair cracked. Doctors later said his ribcage had fractured inward all at once, as though squeezed by an invisible hand. On his chest, beneath the torn fabric, were thin red lines, knots, exactly like the red thread tied around the doll's wrists. 10. After that, the world noticed. Not publicly, not officially, but quietly, urgently. Files vanished. Court orders stalled. Auction notices were withdrawn without explanation. The land around Belle Rive was marked unfit, unstable, restricted. No one wanted their name attached anymore. No one except one. Her name was Eleanor Price. A descendant. She found the truth by accident, tracing her family tree late one night, following a line that stopped abruptly in the 1850s. A plantation owner. Louisiana. Belle Rive. The name Devereaux stared back at her from the screen like an accusation. Eleanor did what no one else had done. She came not to claim, not to profit, but to end it. When she crossed the gate, the air thickened, pressing against her skin. The mansion loomed ahead, windows dark, waiting. Inside, the dolls lay arranged in their near-complete circle. 10 threads pulled tight, 3 slack. Eleanor spoke aloud, voice shaking. I know what was done here. The shadows shifted. I don't want the land. I don't want the house. I want to return it. Give it back. For the first time in more than a century, the spirits hesitated. Ezekiel stepped from the darkness, his form clearer than ever, scarred skin, hollow eyes filled with old fire. He studied Eleanor the way one studies a wound that has never healed. Ownership is the chain, he said, his voice layered with others. Chains must break. Eleanor swallowed. Then take my name off it. Take all our names off it. Outside, the ground trembled. But the spirits were not finished counting. The 11th death came before dawn. A state official who had falsified records to keep the land in limbo was found in his office, buried beneath collapsing shelves. 13 folders crushed his chest, each labeled Bell Rive. 11. The 12th came with confession. An elderly man, last living. Devereaux by blood, shot himself after waking from dreams of burning fields and screaming slaves. On his desk lay a handwritten note, "We never paid." 12. Only one remained. The spirits turned back to Ezekiel. The final debt was not blood. It was release. And release, they warned, would cost him everything he still was. Eleanor watched as the doll's last thread tightened, trembling like a final breath. Outside, the mansion began to crack, not collapse, but open. Because the last death would not belong to a stranger. It would belong to the curse itself. And if Ezekiel chose wrongly, Bell Rive would never sleep again. Not with air, but with memory, walls exhaling screams, floors remembering blood. Cracks spread along the columns, glowing faintly like embers beneath skin. Bell Rive was not collapsing. It was letting go. Eleanor stood frozen as the 13 dolls lifted from the floor at once, suspended by nothing. 12 threads were taut. The 13th, the one made from Ezekiel's own blood and name, quivered, uncertain. The spirits gathered. They were no longer whispers. They were weight, presence, the kind that bends knees and breaks prayers. You opened the door, they said to Ezekiel. You carried our hunger. You bound us to counting. Ezekiel nodded. I know, he replied. For the first time, his voice belonged only to him. I was angry, he said. I was broken. I wanted justice, and I gave you vengeance instead. The spirits did not deny it. You taught us the shape of pain, they answered. Pain wants to continue. Eleanor stepped forward, trembling. Then let it end, she pleaded. Take the land, take the house. No one will own it again. I swear it. The spirits turned to her. Oaths are wind, they said. Blood is law. Ezekiel raised his hand. Then take mine. Silence fell, thick, absolute. The 13th doll drifted toward him. He took it gently, as one might take a child from sleep. The red thread wrapped itself around his wrist, then his arm, then his chest, pulling tight with every memory he carried. You will be unmade, the spirits warned. No name, no shadow, no remembrance. Ezekiel looked around the mansion one last time, the staircase where a woman had died screaming, the hall where chains once echoed, the floor beneath which 13 dolls had waited. Good, he said. He pressed the nail into the doll's heart. There was no scream, there was no blood, there was only release. The threads snapped, one by one, like chains breaking underwater. The dolls fell lifeless to the floor, fabric collapsing into nothing more than cloth and dust. The shadow that had walked the halls dissolved into light so faint it barely existed at all. Outside, the land shuddered, then went still. The mansion did not burn. It did not crumble. It simply emptied. By sunrise, Bell Rive was gone. Where it had stood was an open field, green and quiet, as if nothing had ever been built there. No foundations, no bones, no trace of walls or blood or names carved into wood. Eleanor stood alone, holding a single thing left behind. A small piece of red thread. She buried it. The state later marked the land as protected wetland. No construction, no sale, no ownership. Locals said animals returned first, then birds, then silence that felt clean. As for Ezekiel, no grave bears his name. No story remembers his face. But sometimes, in Louisiana, when the ground is turned for reasons no one can explain, people find something buried deep in the soil. A rusted nail, a scrap of black cloth, and they feel, just for a moment, the unmistakable sense of being watched by something that is no longer angry, only tired, and finally at rest.